Shadow Hack. Chapter 481 Tree Climbing. Cultivators didn't need to pay any money for eating in restaurants or staying in a tavern because no one dared to offend them. After all, cultivators could kill them anytime they wanted. However, the strange matter was that the people of this world found it completely reasonable. In their eyes, this was what was supposed to happen since it was cultivators' privilege. Even if they kill someone's entire family, the common folk could only blame it on their bad luck. In short, it was a twisted viewpoint, which, given his experience, Yunmu naturally understood. There wasn't any need to give much explanation since it had been deliberately created by those who wielded power. Why? Because this was an easy way to control the people. Upon hearing about the imperial clan, Yunmu thought of something and asked, "Is the surname of your imperial clan Ewan?" The shopkeeper immediately lowered his head, not daring to discuss it. But the reaction confirmed Yunmu's guess as being correct. He then asked another thing. "Does your imperial clan have a princess named Ewan Bio?" The heads of the shopkeeper and the others lowered even more. They were about to kneel down in front of Yunmu. What a gall! How could you so casually investigate about Princess Bio? A person wearing the attire of a bailiff appointed by the emperor entered the restaurant. After hearing someone talk about the people of imperial clan unbridledly, his face turned ugly and he brought out his blade. "Take a hike." However, Yunmu's reaction speed was much quicker. He threw his chopsticks, and everyone could see a layer of energy covering them. They flew like arrows and sent the bailiff tumbling away. "He's a cultivator," the people dining in the restaurant cried out in surprise. The origin god town, which was located at the foot of World Ancestor, wasn't unfamiliar with cultivators. The reason they cried out in surprise was because of the special status of cultivators. The bailiff, who was thrown away, didn't suffer many injuries. Yunmu wasn't a monster who would massacre people because of one sentence. As he thought that, he realized something which he had regularly experienced after descending. Cultivators and ordinary people seemed to live in completely different worlds. Although they ran past each other all the time, there wasn't any meeting point between flux experts and common people. Anyway, bailiff's anger allowed Yunmu to find out what he wanted. He finally knew the true identity of Ewan Bio. He also gained information about the Ewan family and how important its name was in this world where tens of thousands of people resided. "Settle the bill for me and lead me to your household registration office so that they can allot me a residence." By the time the bailiff crawled back up, Yunmu had already walked out of the restaurant with his command echoed behind. "Yes, my lord." After that, Yunmu stayed in the town for 2 more days. Once he understood how his current world worked, he left the town to go to the origin god sect. During the 2 days, his understanding of the imperial clan increased, and he understood what sort of power it possessed. The influence of the imperial clan was far more formidable than that of any of the ancient dynasties of Earth which Yunmu knew. He also understood why the origin god sect remained so low-key in the origin world despite being so formidable. Apparently, they weren't an unparalleled existence within the origin god world. There was another race which threatened their existence all the time. Its people were known as insect devils. They were organisms which were strongly related to the strength of the origin god sect. They even had the strength to fight on par against it. In the beginning, they had come from outside the origin god world through the fruits of the ancestor tree. The rise and fall of the origin god sect were both related to World Ancestor. The trifling twig had brought enormous benefits, but in order to protect them, the world had been exhausted in fighting against the insect devils. As for what sort of creatures were the insect devils, it required some extra research. After making some discreet inquiries, Yunmu found that they were creatures born from the ancestor tree. They went through a long period of evolution before taking shape of various humanoid insect devils. Their strength was quite unevenly distributed. The most plentiful type was also the lowest class of insect devils. They had no intelligence and relied completely on their instincts. They were called ancestor insects by the people of the origin god world. Their numbers were really large, and they had a very fast reproduction rate. The ordinary guards of the villages and towns of the origin god world could battle against them with their cold weaponry. The most formidable insect devils were those who had evolved into humanoid form. Not only did they possess the 5 senses, their intelligence wasn't one whit less lower than that of humans. The individual strength of the most formidable insect devils was also no less than that of sage flux experts. Moreover, they were also many in number. Thus, it was quite a strenuous task for the origin god sect to deal with them. This was also the reason why the cultivators received such a heroic treatment in the origin god world. After all, only they had the ability to protect the people. In such a situation, ordinary people could only place their hopes on cultivators, which resulted in the entire origin god world revering them with something akin to fanaticism. With such ambient atmosphere toward the cultivators as well as the cultivation holy lands in the form of the ancestor tree's leaves, it could be said that the number of flux experts, great flux experts, and even sage flux experts being produced in the origin god sect was even more terrifying than that of top-notch first-rate sects. Although Li Yunmu didn't know about the strengths of top-notch first-rate powers, he was clear on the fact that the origin god sect was definitely more powerful than Underworld Serpent. If the strength of the entire origin god world was also counted, then the origin god sect could only be even stronger and not weaker. When Li Yunmu arrived in front of World Ancestor, only then did he realize how terrifyingly large it actually was. The origin god world had only a twig of it, but when Li Yunmu arrived in front of the tree, he sensed the insignificance of humanity. He stepped on the twig and began to climb upwards. Yet it didn't feel like that. Instead of feeling like he was climbing a twig, he felt as if he was climbing an unusually strong wooden wall. The thickness of the branch far surpassed his imagination. It had the diameter of more than 100 meters, so the person climbing would only see a wooden wall before themselves. Li Yunmu kept climbing for a very long time while the system kept recording the data. After a very long time, he finally reached the point where his surroundings were filled with clouds. Chapter 482 Reason for being the Cultivation Holy Land. The ground got farther and farther away. When Li Yunmu reached the clouds, the system informed him that he had reached the 7th layer. He was in the clouds, yet it was only a bit more than halfway up. He guessed that climbing to the 11th layer was a test of endurance and courage for flux experts, so who could say how long would it take? Finally, Li Yunmu reached the 11th layer. When he climbed to the nearest leaf, he noticed that it represented the only flux point in the brain, the celestial point. The tree leaf was 3,000 meters long and almost 900 meters wide. The people who stepped on it would never feel like they were standing on a tree leaf, but as if they had stepped on a floating platform. This leaf, which represented the celestial point, had several hundred people cultivating on it. Clearly, they had just crossed the threshold required to cultivate and barely deserved the name of flux experts. What was worth paying even more attention to were the clothes worn by the several hundred people. They weren't like the ordinary people which Li Yunmu had seen in the town, wearing similar clothes. Instead, they appeared more like the cultivators from the origin world. This betrayed that they had recently returned from the origin world. But what astounded Li Yunmu wasn't this. It was actually the system's sudden words. Reminder: a large amount of high-quality universal flux energy has been accumulated on this tree leaf. It conforms with the optimum threshold to congeal the flux binding pill. Congratulations, host, as long as you occupy one of the tree leaves, a flux binding pill could be congealed. The system suddenly became excited. And Li Yunmu's entire body quivered slightly. Flux binding pills, He hadn't expected that when he stepped on the first tree leaf, he would obtain such an enormous harvest. The thing before him sure enough deserved to be called the leaf of World Ancestor. The conditions and refining method of flux binding pill were in his hands, which meant an extremely fast cultivation as well as an unending stream of wealth. As long as he could accumulate a large amount of contribution points, he could form a power of his own, and it would have endless potential for growth. Why did the people standing on the top of the world controlled such enormous organizations while possessing the authority to draw regulations for countless powers without end? Was it strength? Yes, it was their tyrannical strength which couldn't be challenged. But how did their strength become so tyrannical? It came from their unbelievable wealth. They used their riches on their organization, otherwise, how could such frightening organizations be formed? Everything was linked to money. That was why the people standing at the peak had a tight control over the power grain, flux binding pills, flux points, as well as a large amount of body tempering skills, flux expert skills, and all sorts of secret techniques which allowed them to control the entire cultivation system of the origin world. They were the true eternal masters of the origin world. As long as someone could obtain the monopoly on those things, they could become one of the most powerful people in the world. And Li Yunmu had just secured such a future for himself because the system had finally informed him that he could produce flux binding pills. Although he could only manufacture power grain and flux binding pills for the moment, this was tantamount to him entering through the door to the path of becoming one of the few people standing on top of the vast origin world. In an instant, Li Yunmu became impatient and unable to control himself. But being anxious was useless. If he wished to occupy a leaf to cultivate, he had to obtain the strength of a great flux expert. Otherwise, he wouldn't possess the qualification to occupy any of the leaves even on the first layer. Once he thought about it, Li Yunmu lost the interest in staying on the leaf of Celestial Point. He rushed toward the other leaves. Although he didn't stay for long on any leaf in his hurry toward the farther parts of the 108 tree leaves, he still wasted a large amount of time. This was because each of the leaves covered an extremely large area. Moreover, they weren't concentrated together, so Li Yunmu was forced to keep running along the twig. After he passed through the enormous leaves without stopping until dusk arrived, he finally found the path to the 101st leaf. Heaven Frost Point Holy Land. Li Yunmu suddenly stopped in front of one leaf and raised his head to read the banner erected over it. Heaven Frost Point, this is it. Besides the final 3 points, he lacked 5 flux points to open 105 flux points. And Heaven Frost Point was one of the guardian points of the 3 main points which were in the chest C, abdomen C, and navel star. In the origin world, people called the chest C, abdomen C, and navel star flux points as sun, moon, and star points. Among them, the chest C and abdomen C points had 8 guardian points surrounding and protecting them. They formed a ring and stored flux energy. As for the final navel star point, it was an independent existence which existed 1 inch above the navel. After repeatedly confirming that the leaf before him was precisely the place to cultivate Heaven Frost Point, Li Yunmu walked inside it. Once he stepped onto it, he discovered that there weren't many people cultivating on this leaf. In total, there were only 30 people. They had completely forgotten about themselves and were cultivating without regard for anything. Li Yunmu had purchased the method to attack Heaven Frost Point long ago, so without saying anything, he also followed the example and found a quiet place to sit down. He then began to attack the flux point. After a few moments, he was astonished. Only now did he understand the reason behind why the Origin God Sect considered the 108 tree leaves as the holy land for cultivating 108 flux points. Once he sat down on the leaf of the ancestor tree, he discovered that his speed of absorbing flux energy far surpassed his imagination. Chapter 483 She Comes Out. How is that possible? Li Yunmu was astonished by the terrifying rate of flux energy absorption. He forcefully halted his cultivation and awakened from the meditative state. System, how many times higher was my absorption rate of flux energy compared to the ordinary absorption rate in the origin world? He asked in complete astonishment. Reporting to host, if your usual rate of absorption of flux energy in the origin world was represented as 1 unit, your speed here would be 18 units, the system calmly replied. When it had discovered a large amount of high-quality flux energy on the tree leaves, it had done a complete scan. 18 times? You mean that the cultivation efficiency on the ancestor tree's leaf is 18 times compared to the outside world? Li Yunmu almost went crazy. Wrong. It's just the absorption rate that is 18 times that of the outside world. If the cultivation efficiency as a whole was taken into account, it would be 32 times higher. The flux energy absorption speed of 18 times had caused Li Yunmu to go crazy, yet the system presented him with another astonishing fact. Apparently, the actual cultivation efficiency was 32 times that of the outside world. What is the meaning of this? How have you calculated that? 32 times higher cultivation efficiency truly frightened Li Yunmu. What was the meaning of it? If any cultivator knew that the cultivation speed here was 32 times higher than in the origin world, they would probably go crazy. It has to be known that in the origin world that if a cultivator attacked a flux points by relying on the flux energy in the world and had no outside assistance, then opening it in a dozen years was just a pipe dream. That was why cultivators in the outside world wouldn't simply engage in bitter cultivation. The life expectancy of humans was finite. Because of that, the majority of them would use various means to accumulate contribution points to purchase flux binding pills and increase their cultivation speed like this. Yet in the origin God sect people only needed to stay on the leaf of the ancestor tree to cultivate, and their cultivation speed would be 32 times higher. In other words, they didn't need to bother about collecting contribution points. They needed to just concentrate on cultivating, and within half a year, they would have opened all 108 flux points. This was an outrageous fact which would leave people astonished. It was then that Li Yunmu understood the reason why Origin God Sect acted in such a low-key manner, as well as why they guarded their sect's entrance so thoroughly. After all, if this secret was leaked outside, they would become the target of all the powers in the origin world who would attack them without any hesitation. It showed up that the threat of the insect devils wasn't the main reason why Origin God Sect stayed quiet in the outside world. So what you're saying is that the flux energy absorption rate here is 18 times higher. But if taken as a whole, the cultivation efficiency in this place is 32 times higher than in the origin world. On top of that, the absorbed flux energy is extremely pure, so the process of opening and filling the flux points is smooth and easy, unlike outside where it could fail many times. The system's precise analysis was reliable. Since it was certain of its calculations, Li Yunmu was convinced that the number 32 was only a conservative estimate and definitely not an exaggeration. After learning this, his heart sank. Origin God Sect possessed World Ancestor Twig, which was simply too terrifying. They could create a great flux expert from a physical expert within half an year. It was the same as creating soldiers with ease. They could increase their number of great flux experts at a steady rate. It has to be known that a great flux expert, even if they were just of the first rank, would be equivalent to a Nirvana expert of Earth. When 10 such Nirvana experts joined hands, then even ordinary flux sages couldn't fight back. Terrifying, truly terrifying. Host doesn't need to worry too much. It is impossible for Origin God Sect to cultivate great flux experts at this speed. You mustn't forget that the origin world is the main thing restricting their growth. After all, for each cultivator they produce, they must send it to be nurtured in the origin world. As long as they are being restricted by this factor, then regardless of whatever magical techniques they possess, they can't develop quickly. Not to mention that the Origin God Sect is still being threatened by the insect devils. These creatures from the outside surely kill many cultivators of the Origin God world every day, the system said. Its words sounded like they held the truth of the matter. After thinking about it, Li Yunmu's heart finally calmed down, and he began to cultivate once more, silently entering the meditative state again. 9 days passed in no time. During them, Li Yunmu remained immersed in cultivating on the tree leaf until he finally broke through the heaven frost point. This was the first time he'd absorbed flux energy naturally and opened a flux point without using flux binding pills. As a matter of fact, his speed was only a little slower than when he'd used flux binding pills. But even so, this was still unusually terrifying. After another 5 days, Li Yunmu filled the heaven frost point with flux energy. It meant that he'd finished with the 101st point and only 4 flux points remained before he opened the 105 points. Li Yunmu rested for a night and then at dawn rushed toward the next flux point's Holy Land. Hanqi Point is also one of the guardian points of the chest sea. After experiencing cultivation on the tree leaf for the first time, he had become quite proficient. After 8 days, he opened the Hanqi Point and used another 3 days to quickly fill it up. After it he began to attack the 103rd point. Just when Li Yunmu was moving toward the Holy Land of 103rd point, Yuan Biao came out of seclusion. After making some mental calculations, she realized that it had been exactly 1 month since she'd brought Li Yunmu, no Lin Qingyang, to the Origin God Sect. In this month, her presence had changed completely. If Li Yunmu would have been in front of her at this moment, he'd definitely be astonished. What sort of cultivation speed was that? In just a month, Yuan Biao, who had been a mid-stage flux expert, had crossed 2 thresholds and entered the great circle of flux expert realm. She had already surpassed Li Yunmu and opened all 108 points in the same time. She only needed to take the final step to congeal the great flux expert armor, and she would enter the great flux expert realm. But before returning to cultivation, she asked, "What is he doing?" Reporting to Princess, apart from the first 3 days which he used to make inquiries in the town, he has been engaged in bitter cultivation in the 11th layer. He is quickly advancing toward opening the 105 point, a serving woman answered. "Oh, that's pretty good. With him cultivating so quickly, it seems like after learning about the Origin God world, he is hell-bent on staying here." Yuan Biao smiled. Chapter 484 Loss of Contact with Li Yunmu. Yuan Biao was certain that after any flux expert from the outside personally witnessed the strength and reserves of the Origin God world, they would lose all hope and wouldn't try to escape. After all, the only path to the Origin world was through the 12th layer of World Ancestors twig, which meant the bloom. What sort of people lived in that region? They were the upper echelons and imperial clan of the Origin God Sect. Every person who had the qualification to stay there was at least a sage flux expert. Naturally, people like Yuan Biao, who were related to Yuan family, as well as some of the servants who were ordinary people, were an exception. The bloom of the ancestor tree could be said to be the most formidable region where all the powerhouses of the Origin God world were concentrated. Even the gold serpent kings of the Underworld Serpent probably wouldn't have the slightest chance to infiltrate that place. Because of that, Yuan Biao was certain that with time Li Yunmu would fall into complete despair and wouldn't even think of escaping her world. He would even stop hoping to flee from her grasp. Since the other party had caused her Lin Qingyang to disappear, she would only be compensated if the other party would substitute for her Lin Qingyang. According to Yuan Biao's thinking, she would slowly grind down Li Yunmu's resistance until he admitted defeat. After that, she would slowly guide him and turn him into her Lin Qingyang to the extent that both his words and actions would be exactly the same. In the Origin God world, she had complete confidence in achieving this because she was its princess. A true princess and not the countless princesses of imperial clans. As for Li Yunmu's background, she'd heard that he had arrived from an outer plane. Even if he had joined Underworld Serpent later on, Origin God Sect's power was definitely greater. She was certain that Li Yunmu would have realized that already. After a lot of hesitation, the servant still chose to speak up. "Princess, you truly intend to recruit him? You should know that when Prince Yuan heard that you recruited an outsider man, he was very resentful. No need to bother about him. Even my father, the Emperor, cannot meddle in my affairs, let alone him." A hint of fierceness flashed through Yuan Biao's face. From the looks of it, once she returned to the Origin God world, her identity and temperament had undergone an enormous change. But probably it was more accurate to say that she had been this sort of person from the start. Her innocence and kindness were only reserved for the real Lin Qingyang. But unfortunately, he hadn't known what sort of status she possessed and acted indifferent toward her. Is there really no need to worry about him? I'm afraid that Prince Ewan will send people to find some trouble for him. Prince Ewan trying to find trouble for him is also good. It would teach him a lesson. Oh right, he hadn't tried to get in contact with any other women during this time. While the crazy woman Yuan Biao was asking about Li Yunmu's situation, the man in question had already entered the Holy Land of the 104th flux point and began to attack it. As long as he could cultivate all of the 105 flux points, he could exploit the benefits of the Origin God world and cultivate the final 3 flux points which were very difficult to obtain in the Origin world. Li Yunmu had indeed completely renounced the idea of trying to escape before he cultivated all the flux points. But this didn't mean that he had fallen into despair and wasn't thinking about struggling. Rather, he was profoundly aware that regardless of how much a person schemed or planned, they wouldn't be able to do anything without enough strength. Regardless of whether it was the Origin world or the Origin God world or even Earth, strength reigned supreme in all worlds. Time continued to pass. In the Origin world's Whale City, Anne was sitting with her brows creased. How long has it already been? 2 months had passed since Li Yunmu was recruited by the mysterious second-tier Origin God Sect. But Underworld Serpent's secret communication technique still hadn't returned with any information. Could it be that the Origin God Sect could even block our Underground Serpent's exclusive communication technique? Before long, a member of Underworld Serpent with golden thread covering her chest silently entered the room and reported, "Miss Anne, the main headquarters have once again inquired regarding our spy." If Li Yunmu had been there, he would have certainly been very astonished. Although he knew that Miss Anne's position in the Underworld Serpent wasn't low, he wouldn't have guessed that she would be accompanied by a gold-ranked member. After some thought, Anne decided to reply with the truth. "No need to hide anything. Inform that main headquarters that our spy's operation has failed. There's been no news from him, and his whereabouts are unknown." In fact, after Li Yunmu had boarded the H.A.C.K ship of the Origin God Sect, she had dispatched people with all sorts of tricks to follow them secretly. However, at one moment, the H.A.C.K ship had miraculously disappeared without any trail. This sort of coincidence combined with main headquarters' interest in the Origin God Sect gave Anne a feeling that she was faced with something nowhere near as simple as she'd been led to believe. By then, she had already lost and didn't have any backup plans left. She could only inform the main headquarters about the situation and get them involved. The only unfortunate thing in that was that her new recruit Li Yunmu had also gone missing. After all, he could refine extreme-grade power grain as well as had contact with an ancient sea devil beast clan. Regardless of however she considered it, both of the things were greatly useful to her. "All right, I will do that." The gold-ranked member retreated, and Anne immediately contacted another person. "Madam Anne, were you looking for me? Please give me your instructions." Anne thought for a bit, then commanded, "Old Yan, if suitable, help me show some consideration for 2 people. But don't leave any tracks when you take care of them." "Other plane descenders?" "Both of them are minor people who have entered second-tier sects after this year's intersect battles and are in the region under my responsibility. I know what to do." When Old Yan looked through the information, he was quite surprised. He couldn't think of any reason why Madam Anne would want to pay so much attention toward 2 outsiders, both of whom were just flux experts. After disconnecting the call with Old Yao, Anne lowered her head and immersed herself in other matters of the organization. She had a feeling that Li Yunmu wasn't that simple. In the short time he spent in the Origin world, he had first built a relationship with the Hall clan, after which he had also developed a friendship with Sea Breeze Whale clan. On top of that, he could refine extreme-grade power grain, which clearly showed his talent. There wasn't any information about his current situation, but Anne decided to show consideration for his 2 followers, which could be considered as an investment. Focused on that, she had no idea that her choice would save Li Qinghong's life. Chapter 485 Li Qinghong's Resolve. Green Goblin Mountains in the North Blue was both a mountain range as well as the symbol of an enormous sect. In the several tens of thousands of miles in the vicinity, there was probably no one who didn't know the prestige of its name. Each and every person in the households of this region were determined to enter the Green Goblin sect since they were children. However, very few people could enter this mountain sect considered as one of the top-notch second-tier sects in the origin world. According to the legends, the name came from the founder of the Green Goblin sect who had once captured a green goblin beast some 10,000 years ago. Reportedly, this beast had already entered devil beast category. If it was still alive after 10,000 years, it would have certainly entered deity level. The main reason why the Green Goblin sect could survive through numerous cruel wars and stand among the top second-tier sects was because of its legendary Green Goblin beast acting as a guardian beast of the mountain. Although no one knew whether the Green Goblin beast was still alive after such a long time, they could see that none of the first-tier powers had made a move on Green Goblin Mountains. Because of that, everyone was suspicious in their heart. In the last inter-sect battle of Blue Moon Sect, 2 disciples had been extremely fortunate to obtain the invitation of Green Goblin Sect. Although Li Yunmu couldn't understand why the third-tier sects of the origin world would allow their disciples with superior talents to be snatched away with smiles on their faces, Blue Moon Sect had wantonly celebrated for 3 days because of the event. They even publicly announced on all the islands under their control that Li Qinghong had successfully jumped tiers to enter Green Goblin Sect. As for why Blue Moon Sect viewed it with such great importance, it was mainly because being recruited by Green Goblin Sect wasn't easy. In the previous 5 years, not one person had been recruited by this top-notch second-tier sect. In a short while, Li Qinghong's name spread through the entire North Blue. But at this moment, the main character of the wildfire-like rumors, Li Qinghong, was standing atop a small mountain of Green Goblin Sect, gazing at a distance with a hint of gloominess on her face. With the completely refined undying sage blood as well as the frightening potential and willpower, she had successfully completed the mission given to her by Li Yunmu. Moreover, because of her request, Demon was also judged leniently and was able to enter Green Goblin Sect. Her performance in Blue Moon Sect's inter-sect battle had been extremely dazzling. Even if she wasn't able to obtain the first place and was only ranked 3rd. The undying property displayed by her as well as her potential immediately attracted the attention of Green Goblin Sect, and they chose her instead of the top-ranked person. However, despite being considered important, Li Qinghong hadn't felt the slightest bit of happiness in the past 2 months she had spent in the Green Goblin Mountains. The main reason was that Li Yunmu had completely disappeared. They had lost all contact with him. Because of the deep connection between Master and their followers, they knew that he wasn't facing life-threatening crisis, but this was the first time she was in the predicament of having lost all contact with Li Yunmu. Behind her, Demon suddenly appeared and asked, "Ching-hong, still no news from him?" In order to hide their connection with Li Yunmu, they had stopped using his name and just referred to him in their conversations. "No, I feel that he has encountered an unprecedentedly dangerous situation. Yet we are still well and alive." A hint of worry flashed past Li Qinghong's cold face. She didn't finish her sentence, but Demon, who was also a follower like her, understood. Although they were living well, it was the first time since they had bound their soul imprints to Li Yunmu's heavenly world that they couldn't sense his existence. It has to be known that even after descending to the origin world, they could still sense a faint connection to Flowing Cloud or Blade Overlord. But they could no longer sense Li Yunmu's existence at all. What was the meaning of that? What sort of trouble had he encountered that even though all 3 of them were in the same world, they had still lost all connection? Li Qinghong and Demon were completely blind. But this matter wasn't the cause of their current distress. Although their master had disappeared, they were still alive, which proved that at the very least their master was alive and not dead. What truly caused Li Qinghong distress was the damned daughter of the master of Green Goblin Sect. In the past 2 months, she had been tormented by that woman to no end. That was written right, without any mistake. Who could have expected that the daughter of the Grand Sect Master of a top-class second-tier sect would surprisingly be not fond of men? Since Li Qinghong had arrived, that woman had been completely charmed by her cold demeanor, and things got out of hand pretty quickly. If she had known about this previously, Li Qinghong would have never chosen Green Goblin Sect. In the past couple days, I've heard that the daughter of Goblin Master is reportedly the darling of the entire upper echelon. She is said to be the only person who can enter 10,000 Beast Cave. Demon suddenly turned serious and mentioned the rumors he had heard previously. 10,000 Cave? Is it the rumored residence of Green Goblin Beast that everyone talks about inside and outside the sect? Could it be that people believe that the Devil Beast is still alive after 10,000 years? Li Qinghong shook her head. I don't know. It's also extremely possible that our Green Goblin Sect has deliberately placed this smoke bomb. But it is also possible that it is true, otherwise, although the status of Goblin Master's daughter is high, the sect wouldn't let her run amok like that, Demon said with a bitter smile. Goblin Master's daughter's name was Qing-hong. In private, everyone called her Yunmu. Only those staying in the sect knew what sort of unbridled person she was. Don't speak of her. Soon, the 3 months agreed time between him and us will come. If he doesn't appear then, I plan to leave Green Goblin Mountains and execute the plan he'd told us before, Li Qinghong said with absolute certainty. Do you really think that we can accomplish it, with our strength? Hearing her words, Demon turned gloomy. The matter Li Qinghong was talking about was what Li Yunmu had planned to complete previously. It was to deal with the other descenders from their earth. It didn't necessarily mean killing them, just ensuring complete control over them so that they wouldn't return to Earth at the first possible chance and provide a suitable body to the ancient god undercurrent. A mission like that had to be completed. It wasn't certain that everyone would understand reason or would believe them though, so they might have to use physical force. Demon didn't dare to guess how much had the strength of that group of proud sons and daughters of heaven grown during the time they hadn't seen each other. At least he wasn't completely confident that with his present strength he could compare to Luo Tian, Man Tian, or Hai Yu. Even if Li Yunmu was present, he would still not be 100% certain they could do it. Yet Li Qinghong was prepared to use her life to execute this plan. Does she intend to go through with the plan only to follow Master's orders? Or because it is a matter which concerns the future of our Earth? Sometimes, Demon couldn't see through his companion. Chapter 486 Wrong Method. After a month, Li Yunmu finally opened his eyes on the holy land of 105th Flux Point. Right away, an incomparably pure flux energy erupted from his body. Its purity even awoke the other cultivators cultivating on the same leaf from their meditative state. That was because Li Yunmu was disturbing the movement of flux energy of World Ancestor's leaf in the vicinity. This disturbance left all other cultivators extremely astonished. But Li Yunmu quickly realized what was happening and restrained his flux energy, thus removing the disturbance. He definitely couldn't let the fact that his flux energy strength was far more formidable than that of the other cultivators of the same layer to be revealed. System, how's my present strength? After confirming that the others weren't paying any more attention, he quickly inquired about his strength. Host, your flux energy strength has reached 350 points. Your physical strength has also increased greatly, it has reached 150 oxen. The system's reply shocked Li Yunmu. With the cultivation of meridian nurturing flux point technique every day, the upper limit of his flux energy strength was growing increasingly higher. After cultivating 105 flux points, the upper limit of his flux energy had long surpassed the limit faced by the other cultivators of the same layer, to the extent that it was almost double. 150 oxen was normally the bottleneck for physical strength of third-rank great flux experts. However, he had reached that threshold before he had even stepped into great flux expert realm. It wouldn't be outrageous to say that regardless of whether it was his flux energy strength or physical strength, his general strength far surpassed that of cultivators of the same layer. But that wasn't the most important part. What mattered the most was that he had finally cultivated all the 105 points required to become a great flux expert. The majority of cultivators in the origin world didn't have any foresight and ambition, and they would immediately break through to Great Flux Expert Realm, but Li Yunmu naturally wouldn't make such a choice. Quickly, his gaze fell on the final 3 tree leaves in the depths. Based on an estimation with a naked eye, the final 3 leaves of the 11th layer were far larger than the 105 before them. He could vaguely guess that the final 3 leaves were much more than just a few kilometers in length. Li Yunmu took a deep breath and began to walk toward the 106th tree leaf, which represented one of the final 3 flux points. Halt! You need to show a recommendation letter to enter the place to cultivate the final 3 flux points. Li Yunmu had to admit that the cultivation holy lands of the final 3 flux points were indeed very different from the previous 105. This fact was clearly illustrated by the strength of guards guarding the entrance. Additional recommendation letter. Li Yunmu hadn't expected that there would be other conditions to enter there. That's right, you must obtain a recommendation letter from an elder class powerhouse or obtain enough merit points by killing insect devils to enter the final 3 flux points, one of the 2 guards said with a wooden face. When Li Yunmu heard his words, he sighed. Sure enough, the 3 main flux points which were guarded by the people standing at the top of the pyramid of the origin world were not as easy to obtain as he had imagined. Even in the origin god world, which had its own rules, not all flux points were open to everyone, as he had heard from rumors. Yet what sort of existence were those merit points from insect devils? Given that he possessed the shadow hack system, this condition sounded like the easiest one to fulfill for him. Regardless of the number of merit points required, he could easily obtain them by hacking all day and night. But he couldn't squander his precious time. He thought for a moment, and an idea struck him. He then took out the recommendation letter given to him by Ewan Bio. Is this sufficient? He asked. Whose recommendation letter is? The guard took a cursory glance. After discovering that it was just a recommendation letter for a status tile, he was about to reject it without any hesitation. Yet the next instant he caught sight of the signature at the bottom and immediately stopped speaking. This. Although it is not the Sect's recommendation, it's all right, you can go. The 2 guards looked at each other, not daring to say anything more. They moved to the side, opening the path toward the H.A.C.K flux points holy land. Li Yunmu secretly observed changes in the attitudes of the 2 guards and again experienced the terrifying influence of Yuan Imperial clan. The 2 guards had the strength of great flux experts, but when they saw Yuan Bio's name, they could only concede and move out of the way. But Li Yunmu didn't think much about it. Since he was allowed to go inside, he walked in without a look back. Once he entered the H.A.C.K holy land, the first thing he discovered was that the surface area was much larger than on the other leaves. But what caught his attention even more was that this region was completely different from the holy lands of the 105 flux points. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There were 8 brightly glowing light balls. Each of them floated above the leaf in a specific location. While hovering over the leaf, they looked like 8 lustrous pearls. Li Yunmu also noticed that there were no other cultivators on the entire leaf, unlike before, where he'd seen many other cultivators meditating. From that, it could be seen that even in the origin god world, the final 3 flux points couldn't be easily accessed by anyone. Li Yunmu looked around for a while, then finally calmed himself and began to attack one of the final 3 flux point. A quarter of an hour passed, then half, then 2 hours, and 3. Li Yunmu woke up from the meditative state at that moment, but he was completely depressed. He just couldn't find the right way to attack the H.A.C.K main point. Even if the density of flux energy on the leaf of World Ancestor was extremely high and Li Yunmu continued absorbing it for half a day, he still couldn't budge the H.A.C.K point in the slightest. Impossible, why is it so difficult to shake this flux point? If even my flux energy strength isn't enough, then how do other people cultivate? For a while, Li Yunmu kept pondering. If you keep attacking the flux point with brute force, then even with the assistance of the Holy Land, you probably won't be able to open it in your lifetime. Oh? You mean that my method of attacking the flux point is wrong? Li Yunmu subconsciously asked. Once he did so, he was stunned to discover that at some point in time, a young lady wearing a green maid skirt had appeared not far from him. When did she appear? Moreover, how come I didn't sense her arrival? Chapter 487 Completely Unreasonable. Li Yunmu snapped to attention and asked with some suspicion, "You are?" "Humph, my name is Yingying. You don't need to know who I am though. If you want to open your chest C point, you must follow my instructions." The little lady who called herself Yingying pointed toward the 8 balls of light floating above the leaf and said, "Can you see them?" Li Yunmu pushed away his suspicions for the time being and nodded. "Naturally I can. From the time I came here, I could see them." "Then there's no problem. Your ability to see them proves that you have indeed opened and filled all the guardian points around the chest C point. Now you need to urge the 8 guardian points which you have already cultivated to separately exploit the flux energy from the corresponding ball of light to assist you in attacking the chest C point." After she finished speaking, she immediately turned around and left without paying any attention to Li Yunmu. So simple. Li Yunmu was startled for a moment. Yet he soon calmed down and stopped wondering about why she had appeared and disappeared so suddenly. He began to cultivate once more. He focused his thoughts, and according to the suggestion of the other party, he began to spur the chest C guardian points individually. Originally, he was debating with himself whether to trust the woman or not, but the next instant, he discovered that he was wrong to have doubted her. The young lady's guidance was indeed effective. When he urged the guardian points individually, the 8 light balls floating above the leaves were activated because of the fluctuation of energy. The next instant, the 8 lights balls shot 8 energy beams toward Li Yunmu. They fell on his body, and a large amount of extremely pure flux energy flowed into his 8 chest C guardian points in a steady stream. It worked. Heavens, what an extremely dense flux energy! Li Yunmu sensed the change in his body and immediately recalled the second step mentioned by the young lady. With a thought from him, the flux energy from the 8 guardian points fiercely rushed toward the chest C main point, which hadn't even budged till then. This time, he could clearly sense that his attack was completely different from the previous time. Back then, he had relied on all 105 flux points in his body to absorb the dense flux energy around him and used it to attack the chest C main point. But at that moment, he was using only the chest C guardian points to do so. Even though the number of flux points he was utilizing was clearly far smaller than before, the 2 attempts were nothing alike. After the guardian flux points received the support of the endless energy from the 8 light balls floating in the air, Li Yunmu was like a completely different person who possesses boundless energy in his body. Breakthrough. When Li Yunmu's 8 guardian points gathered a certain amount of energy, he used the opportunity to erupt them with a thought. This energy fiercely rushed toward the chest C main point, acting as the first attack. Bang! He felt short of breath from the shock. An artillery shell seemed to have exploded in his chest, and all the air he was inhaling leaked out. His legs went soft as if he was about to faint. The wave of shock that almost caused his body to burst into pieces had come close to killing him. But quickly, while feeling the acute pain, Li Yunmu discovered that although the chest C main point hadn't been completely opened, it was the first time that it had budged. It was different from the previous 3 hours of cultivation, which hadn't yielded any results. After discovering that such a method was effective, Li Yunmu didn't care about his chest almost bursting open and began to absorb the energy from the 8 energy beams even more fiercely. For the second attack, he gathered and compressed even more energy compared to before and fiercely launched it without any second thoughts. Rumble. This time, the reaction was even more intense compared to the first time when his chest had almost split apart. It felt as if 2 warheads with different attributes had detonated in his chest. Li Yunmu coughed out a mouthful of blood. By following the instructions of the young lady, he had been seriously injured on just the second turn. How powerful was the impact? His physical strength and absolute defense were sufficient to resist an all-out attack from even a great circle flux expert without being destroyed, let alone him getting injured. However, Li Yunmu was clear on the fact that injuries which would be considered as quite severe by anyone else weren't anything major for him. He quickly unleashed the SSS grade plant essence innate healing reversal. This peak-level life-saving technique had two unique abilities. The first was to absorb the vitality of the plants in the surroundings and use it as a price to heal its user. As long as the plants in the surroundings weren't completely exhausted, he could treat himself. He had named this skill Minor Reversal. The second ability was even more terrifying, and he'd called it Major Reversal. It allowed him to utilize the enormous amount of vitality he had accumulated previously and unleash it to heal himself or someone else. As long as he still had a breath left in him and the large amount of vitality which he had stored previously, then regardless of how serious his injuries were, he could heal himself quickly. This was the power of a peak-level life-saving technique. At that moment, Li Yunmu used Major Reversal with a thought. Because of that, others wouldn't be able to know what sort of major transformation had occurred in his body. Once Major Reversal was unleashed, Li Yunmu, who had received serious injuries just a moment ago, immediately began to recover. His physical body was absolutely tyrannical, and his healing ability was also quite formidable. As soon as Major Reversal was unleashed, the majority of his injuries disappeared instantly. After 10 breaths, he was completely healed. With that settled, it was time for the third attack. Bang! After a few minutes, Li Yunmu, who had gathered the energy once more, launched the third attack. Then the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 13th, 23rd, 33rd. By then, Li Yunmu appeared like a large red-eyed oxen which had been just awoken. He disregarded the injuries to his body and kept brazenly attacking the chest C main point. Ying, who had been watching him secretly, was completely dumbstruck. Impossible! How hasn't he died even after 33 continuous attacks? Moreover, why hasn't his chest C main point opened after so many tries? Under ordinary circumstances, people require only 7 attacks to break it open. Li Yunmu's extraordinary situation left Ying, who was watching secretly, completely flabbergasted. Chapter 488 Trapped in Paradise. Ewan Bio's maid Ying was too shocked for words while watching Li Yunmu attack the flux point like a brute without caring for his life. The chest C main point, abdomen C main point, and navel star point were completely different from the previous 105 flux points. This was because they were the main flux points for storing, cultivating, and moving flux energy. As for the other flux points, they were mainly for assisting. This led to the last 3 flux points being the most difficult to cultivate for the flux experts. The main reason why the people standing at the top of the power pyramid controlled them, making it impossible for the majority of flux experts to access them, was to limit the usage of resources. But there was another reason as well. Only 1% out of 10,000 people would be able to successfully cultivate them. In other words, even if someone was able to obtain the method to cultivate the 3 flux points, it didn't necessarily mean that they would be able to manage that. Of 10,000 people, less than 100 would be successful in breaking through. The reason? Cultivating the 3 flux points required extremely tyrannical physical bodies. Without possessing extremely formidable flesh, it would be impossible for a cultivator to live through the extremely brutal process of opening those flux points. That being said, if only 100 of 10,000 people were successful, what would happen to the 9,900 people who failed? It was extremely possible that the majority of them would be heavily injured, if not end up dead. It was also possible that they would become disabled. They would not only be unable to cultivate to the next step, they couldn't even keep their old cultivation with their gravely injured bodies. This was the reason why the top people in the origin world controlled the 3 flux points and didn't let their cultivation method circulate outside. It was reasonable for them to control the distribution of resources so as to lessen the number of people getting injured and dying while trying to open the flux points. But even so, there were still many people who died while cultivating the 3 main flux points. Those who lived the lives of elites and had great potential, however, were much less likely to lose their lives while attacking the 3 flux points. However, Yunmu was attacking the flux point in a completely unreasonable way. He simply abandoned the common practices followed while opening the last 3 flux points. Normally, after a person stored enough power for the first attack with the assistance of the 8 guardian points, they would require an entire day for recuperating. Once all the injuries healed, they would proceed to launch the second attack, which would be followed by a third, fourth, and fifth, even reaching to the 7th. In the worst case scenario, the chest C main point would be broken at the 10th attack. Yet Yunmu's method to open the flux point was reckless and unreasonable. He was like an undying beast attacking the chest C main point without rest or time to heal his injuries. After Yunmu attacked for the 33rd time, he finally smashed open the chest C main point, which hadn't even budged before. Oh, so comfortable! Once the chest C main point was successfully opened, Yunmu immediately sensed a transformation in the movement of energy in his body, especially in his chest region. Once the chest C main point was opened, the flux points in the vicinity which had already been cultivated immediately linked with it. Every flux point's energy then began to rotate little by little. They began to supply the chest C main point with flux energy in a steady stream. The chest C main point was like an endless pit whose bottom couldn't be seen. It continued to absorb the energy supplied by the flux points in the vicinity without showing any signs of ever going to be filled. Insufficient, still insufficient, far from sufficient. At that instant, Yunmu was like a poor man who hadn't eaten for days. He abruptly raised his head to look at the light balls which resembled the 8 guardian chest points. He required much more energy to completely fill the chest C main point than he possessed right then. If the previously cultivated flux points could be described as planets, then the chest C main point would be the sun. As if they were also linked to the chest C main point in Yunmu's body, the 8 light balls hanging over the leaf shone brightly, and 8 energy beams illuminated his body. At that instant, Yunmu felt how terrifying was the amount of resources required to cultivate the 3 main flux points. If not for the 8 energy beams which supplied him with endless flux energy, he didn't even dare to imagine how many flux binding pills he'd need to fill up the flux point. He had a feeling that without at least 1,000, he definitely wouldn't be able to cultivate successfully. Time continued to pass, and after a few hours, the energy beams from the 8 light balls finally retracted. Yunmu stood up with a bright expression and ample energy. Finally, the chest C main point had been successfully cultivated. Because of doing that, his flux energy had soared from 350 to 500. The flux energy produced by one main point was surprisingly more than 1/3 of the flux energy produced by all the 105 points. 500 points of flux energy strength, Yunmu clenched his fists, hardly able to hold back his excitement. According to what he knew, the data established by the system to count flux energy strength didn't represent the overall amount of flux energy. Instead, it was the peak value of the flux energy with which one could burst forth in an instant. It didn't represent an amount, but rather the qualitative grade of one's attack. The difference between heat energy of 350 degrees and 500 degrees could be analogous to the disparity between flux energy strength of 350 and 500. With such a great increase in flux energy, the experts Yunmu couldn't previously injure would certainly feel his attacks now. A single chest C main point had caused his strength to raise by such an extent. Yunmu couldn't wait to reach the cultivation holy land of the abdomen C point. At that moment, his expression didn't look like that of a person trapped in the origin god world. Instead, he looked like someone who'd found their paradise. Perhaps calling the leaves holy land was fitting for the sect, but for Yunmu, they were heaven. If he hadn't sneaked inside this world, he didn't know how he would have needed to obtain enough resources to fill up the main 3 points. Chapter 489 Completion. When Yunmu left the chest C point's holy land without wasting another moment, Ying, who had been watching in secret, was shocked to the core. My god, he surprisingly used up the resources prepared for 10 people by Origin God Sect for attacking flux points. Ying had no words to describe the bizarre situation which she had just witnessed with her own eyes. It has to be known that the resources Yunmu had just used up were prepared for 10 people. How enormous was that amount? Its worth couldn't be described by ordinary numbers. The maid could already imagine that when the princess heard about this matter, she would have a headache. After all, with such a large amount of resources consumed suddenly, she would have to cover up Yunmu's mess. While Ying was feeling worry for her master, Yunmu entered the cultivation land of Abdomen Sea without stopping. After the last time, he had become much more familiar with the process. With the assistance from the 8 energy balls installed around the Holy Land, he began to crazily attack the Abdomen Sea main point once more. If he hadn't cultivated Great Sun Tyrant body muscle marrow secrets as well as many other top-notch body tempering techniques, or if he didn't possess a life-saving cultivation method, or if he hadn't cultivated the meridian nurturing flux point technique, he would have died long ago. His body would have exploded if he lacked even one of the 3. However, there could be no if. All of the above-mentioned skills which allowed him to obtain an advantage over same-layer cultivators were his foundation which he had built over many years. By the time Ying decided to report his bizarre situation to Ewan Bio, he had already begun to store energy without stopping. In a blink of an eye, his cultivation of Abdomen Sea main point was complete. If it had been anyone else, they would probably require half a month at the least for that. This was based on the resources supplied by the Origin God world to attack flux points. When Ying finally found Ewan Bio and fearfully informed her about Yunmu's cultivation situation, he had already successfully cultivated Abdomen Sea main point. His flux energy increased by another notch, rising from 500 units to 750. Clearly, the grade of flux energy from Abdomen Sea main point surpassed even the interlinked group of flux points in the chest. Naval Star Point, only you remain. In less than 2 days and 1 night, Yunmu had cultivated 2 of the 3 flux points which were considered as the most difficult and most hazardous. He was moving at the speed of a rocket. On the 3rd day, Yunmu had already entered the Holy Land of Naval Star Flux Point. It was the final checkpoint before he could step into Great Flux Expert Realm with the most perfect cultivation. At first contact, Yunmu became aware that the Naval Star Point's cultivation method was completely different from the other 2 flux points. This time, there weren't 8 energy balls to provide him with energy. Instead, an enormous stone crystal was arranged on the leaf. It was azure and extremely enormous. This is a devil beast's core. Once Yunmu attentively observed the stone crystal for a good moment. He checked and repeatedly confirmed that it was the core of a devil beast. Moreover, looking at its azure color, it should have come from deep ocean sea devil beast. After confirming this, Yunmu couldn't help but take in a deep breath. What extravagance, they are truly too extravagant. He hadn't expected that Origin God Sect would arrange such a luxurious environment for cultivating the final Naval Star Point. They surprisingly used such a thing as a Devil Beast's core. Devil Beast's strength was equivalent to that of Sage Flux experts. Moreover, according to what Yunmu knew, the strength of the Devil Beasts was even a grade higher than that of Sage Flux experts on the same layer. This was because Devil Beasts possessed innately tyrannical bodies, terrifying physical strength, and bloodlines which made them much more formidable than Sage Flux experts. This was a publicly known fact. Moreover, sea devil beasts were even more formidable than devil beasts living on land. Because they resided deep within the ocean all year round, both their bodies and physical strength were much more tyrannical. Thus, upon seeing a sea devil beast's core, Yunmu was certain that there was certainly a deity-level powerhouse in the Origin God world. The confirmation of this fact left him astonished. But in any case, all of that was secondary to him. What mattered to him at that moment was how to use the sea devil beast's core to cultivate the Naval Star Point. Yunmu subconsciously searched the vicinity, but he could no longer find that little girl Ying, so he could only rely on himself. But this time, the situation wasn't as bad and didn't leave him without any ideas about how to proceed. He tried to move the flux energy in all the flux points in his body, and sure enough, when he moved all the flux energy he had accumulated, a bizarre thing happened. An enormous suction force came from the sea devil beast's core floating in midair. In a flash, Yunmu was entered inside it. Once he was within the core, he sensed that the space around him was filled with gentle energy. It was extremely soft, and when immersed in it, he felt like an infant lying in their mother's bosom. Yunmu's consciousness gradually faded. The comfort caused him to fall asleep without knowing and put down all his defenses. After a long time, he awakened and discovered that he had cultivated the navel star flux point. Moreover, each and every cell in his body had reached the most perfect state. All the concealed injuries which had remained in his body from cultivating the flux points in the barbaric way were gone. Even major reversal had been unable to cure them, but now he could sense that all of them were gone. In an instant, Yunmu understood what had happened. The final cultivation Holy Land was clearly prepared by the origin God world as the ultimate place for healing. After all, it was certain that some hidden injuries would remain in the disciples' bodies after cultivating chest C and abdomen C flux points. And because of that sea devil beast's core, Yunmu was again in perfect condition. He also had a vague sensation that the upper limit of his flux energy strength had increased again. So the reason behind Origin God Sect's cultivators breaking the upper limit of flux energy strength was the spell formation arranged here. Yunmu gained a better understanding of the events. He breathed a sigh of relief, but also a hint of disappointment at the same time. He was relieved that Origin God Sect didn't have any parts of meridian nurturing flux point technique. This made it so there wouldn't be any conflict between him and the Origin God Sect whose strength was immeasurable. But he was disappointed because even the Origin God Sect which possessed such an enormous background couldn't get a hold of other parts of meridian nurturing flux point technique. If it wasn't able to do it, then him trying to collect all the 5 parts may not be anything more than a pipe dream. Chapter 490 Can't cover a fire with paper. Origin God Sect's upper echelons were truly startled. Even if Ewan Bio tried to clear Yunmu's mess as much as possible, the resources prepared for several people to attack the chest C and abdomen C main points had been exhausted by him alone. The guards didn't dare to conceal such an important matter and quietly reported to their superiors at first opportunity. By the time Ewan Bio hurried to the cultivation Holy Land of Naval Star Point, the upper echelons of Origin God Sect had also went there. "Why have you all come?" When Ewan Bio saw 3 elders of Origin God Sect along with a royal uncle who represented the Ewan imperial clan arriving personally, her expression immediately turned dark. Regardless of what methods she used to retaliate against Yunmu, she would never allow outsiders to get involved. She ruthlessly looked at the 2 guards following behind the elders. "Princess, we heard that a situation has occurred in the Holy Land of the 3 main flux points. I represent the sect master in investigating this, so I will trouble you to go easy on us," the leader of the 3 elders said to Ewan Bio in an extremely polite tone. Yet he didn't show any intention of withdrawing. It wasn't that they didn't want to give the princess face, but that the situation reported by the guards was too important to the Origin God Sect. Who was this person who could absorb the flux energy resources prepared for more than 10 people? If the Origin God Sect couldn't even find the truth about this, then how could they talk about ruling the entire Origin God world? "Young Yao, I heard that this man is someone you brought from the outside." Compared to the polite tone of the elder, Ewan Bio's royal uncle who had also rushed over with them wasn't very polite and directly inquired about what interested him. But even though he was her elder and belonged to the same family, his tone was still filled with respect toward his niece. "So what? Royal uncle and you seniors, I hope that you won't get involved in this matter. Only I alone am enough to deal with this matter. He isn't affiliated to any person and isn't anyone's subordinate," Ewan Bio said, trying to force them back with an ugly expression. "We're sorry, but this is a command given by the sect master. Be at ease, princess, we only want to find out what happened and won't make much contact with your people. Moreover, this matter won't be a bad thing for him, the leader of the three elders said. While he spoke, another elder revealed the investigation command with the seal of the sect master himself. After Yuan Biao saw this, a hint of hesitation finally appeared on her face. She could have never anticipated that this fiend Li Yunmu would surprisingly attract the attention of the upper echelons of Origin God Sect just by cultivating a flux point. If that wasn't enough, he had even disturbed Origin God Sect's sect master. What sort of character was the sect master? He was a person who stood at the top of all the cultivators in the Origin God world and could determine their fate with one sentence. In the Origin God world, there were two types of power. The Origin God Sect ruled over the cultivators, while Imperial Yuan clan were the royalty which ruled over the countless people in their world. The two powers were intertwined and kept each other in control. They determined the future of the Origin God world, and neither of them could ignore the other. If the Origin God Sect used the power of the sect to force Yuan Imperial clan, they would lose the support of the people of the entire world and lose the right to reign over them. It was even possible that many cultivators might also turn into their enemies. This was because Yuan Imperial clan possessed enormous influence as well as deeply rooted foundation in the Origin God world. That was why under ordinary circumstances, even the upper echelons of Origin God Sect would take the initiative to yield in front of Imperial Yuan clan. But this time, the situation was a lot different. If the sect master of the Origin God Sect gave a command and Yuan Biao publicly refuted it, then the consequences of this couldn't even be imagined. Royal Uncle became anxious upon seeing that the matter was getting out of hand and said in hopes to make her choose the right thing, "Yao, they only want to understand the situation and hadn't come to catch people." "All right, but he hasn't come out yet. All the matters need to wait until he is finished with his cultivation." After those words, Yuan Biao stepped aside and opened the path to Naval Star Point Leaf. She took the initiative to enter the cultivation Holy Land with Yingying in tow. When the elders saw Yingying, the little maid walking in front of them, their eyebrows jumped simultaneously as if confronting this maid was even more terrifying than confronting Yuan Biao. All of them entered the Naval Star Point's leaf one after another. Soon, their gazes were attracted by the enormous core of the sea devil beast in midair. At that moment, the core floating in the air above the spell formation in the cultivation Holy Land was emitting waves of blue light similar to a gas flame, and the entire core appeared to be translucent. After careful observation, they could vaguely see a strong male figure sitting cross-legged inside with his eyes closed and absorbing the rich energy in the core. "How long has it been since he came here?" one elder suddenly asked. "Quite a while has passed, more than 9 hours," the two guards who had been guarding the Naval Star Point all along promptly replied. "Then we wait until he is finished with his cultivation." The three elders looked at each other, then at Yuan Biao, who still had an ugly expression on her face, and instantly sensed a headache. They walked to the side and sat down crossed to wait. However, while they were waiting, they gradually began to feel that something was odd about the situation. "Hey, how long has it been?" After a long while one of the elders asked again. It has been more than 12 hours now," one of the two guards who hadn't dared to leave during the whole event and was waiting by the side replied quickly. "Seems like something is really fishy here. I remember cultivating the Naval Star Point as a flux expert, and I don't think it took me so long," one of the elders said, unable to understand what was happening. Chest C main point and abdomen C main points were the front 2 points, each of which was united with a cluster of flux points in the vicinity. But Naval Star Point was very different. It was an independent flux point. The movement and storage of flux energy in this independent flux point wasn't influenced by other flux points. In other words, it was like a reserve pool of flux energy for the flux experts. Even if all of their flux energy was exhausted, as long as their Naval Star Point existed, their strength wouldn't be completely gone. It would allow them to not give the enemy the chance to take advantage of their weakness. Similarly, it also ensured that after a flux expert had used their fatal move and erupted with a powerful attack, they would possess power to be used as a reserve. After cultivating this point, flux experts could use it as a secondary source of flux energy, avoiding the situation in which they couldn't protect themselves against the enemy. Because of that, cultivators who hadn't cultivated the final 3 flux points would remain eternally unable to surpass the cultivators at the true Great Circle in terms of battle prowess.